Thank you very much. I want to call Jonathan Edwards from Plaid Cymru and then David T.C. Davis. Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Owen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owen. It's a huge privilege to serve under your chairmanship and particularly speaking today for the first time in the language of heaven, and may I express my hope that this principle will be extended to other committees of this House. For example, the Welsh Affairs Select Committee led by the member for Monmouth. We are meeting today to discuss the dreadfully disappointing budget, the OBR analysis, which came about at the same time as the budget, was truly depressing, downgraded forecasts for business investment, productivities, as well as economic growth. And this was for the second budget on the bounce. It's true that the philosophy of expansionary fiscal contraction pursued by the Treasury since 2010 has completely failed. The whole point of austerity and cutting back public investment was that it was supposed to lead to a bonanza in private enterprise and investment. Together with cutbacks in infrastructure investment, the reverse has happened, of course, as we consistently warned. All of this together leading to chronic productivity levels. Indeed, the chronic levels of UK productivity is the main story for the UK.
And the major issue in the budget, and the situation that we find ourselves in, of course, was totally foreseeable.
The end result has been that the Treasury has missed its debt and deficit targets by a country mile. This was all supposed to be under control by 2015. It was supposed to be a 5-year project. It looks like further fiscal contraction will now continue until the end of the next decade. Now, economic historians of the future won't look kindly at the UK government. We face a lost generation in terms of living standards, the biggest squeeze since the Napoleonic Wars, likely to continue till at least 2025, according to the Resolution Foundation. Of course, this came about as a result of the collapse of sterling.
It's been the least successful devaluation in history, according to economists. Indeed, unlike in China, where the devaluation was driven by the People's Bank of China to make their manufacturing sector competitive, the devaluation in sterling was a direct result of markets betting against sterling as a currency, which does not reflect well on what will happen in the future following Brexit. And the fact, of course, that there's been no export boom following the devaluation of the currency, the fact that the currency has not rebounded without over a year of promises with the British government outlining its position on Brexit does not bode well for the future.
Simon Hart.
Manufacturing output and export are the highest for a decade. Is anyone aware of that?
Well, the export boom that you would expect from a 20% devaluation in sterling has not occurred. That is the factual reality of the situation. The fact that the currency is not rebounding, despite the British government apparently outlining its position on what it wants out of these Brexit negotiations, indicates that the markets are betting against the British government.
Chris Bryant.
There are another, which is one of the biggest mistakes that the Conservative or coalition government made in 2010 was cutting capital budgets, which meant that we didn't have the infrastructure in place that we need for a modern economy, and that has hit productivity across the whole of the country.
Jonathan Edwards.
Well, the member makes a very valid point, and I will return to those issues later in my contribution. Will my colleague give way?
Would my friend agree with the farmers who would be looking ahead thinking that smaller sized sheep would be selling well on the continent, but that is not the message that I am hearing from my farmers in Meirionnydd?
Well, that certainly is the case, and I was reading something yesterday, and it's expected that the price of sheep meat and meat more generally will fall significantly if Wales finds itself outside of the customs union. The risks for the agricultural sector facing us in the very near future are huge, and our parliamentary leader raises a very valid point.
Susan Ellen Jones.
I agree with the honourable member entirely when talking about the crisis in the in agriculture, but does he also believe that we're not just talking about farmers, but rather the broader rural economy as a result of Brexit? This truly is a crisis, isn't it?
The member raises a fundamental point. Agriculture is a focal point for the rural economy, and if agriculture suffers, then other sectors will suffer, such as tourism and all sorts of others. I could make a lengthy speech on what needs to be done to protect our agricultural sector, Mr. Owen, but I may be outside the scope of the budget in doing so. But I truly believe, Mr. Owen, that Brexit is such a fundamental point that this Grand Committee should meet again very soon to discuss the government's policy, because I think that is the major challenge facing us as a government. I'm sure the government will have listened to your words. Thank you, Mr. Owen. To return to the budget, the UK, the British state, has fallen from 4th to 6th in the global economic tables, lost its AAA credit rating, and it's the worst performing economy in the G7. The much maligned Eurozone growing at a rate that the British economy can only dream of. Now, the Irish economy in the third quarter year on year is growing 10.5% last year, where the Welsh economy, of course, is facing very anemic growth. Now, the truth is, as the member for Rhondda said, that following the crash in 2010, we didn't tackle the structural deficiencies. What happened to the pledges to address sectoral and geographical wealth inequalities? That's what George Osborne was talking about consistently in 2010. They are now chronic, Mr. Owen, and they are getting worse. It's no wonder then that the benches opposite are no longer parroting their slogan, the long-term economic plan. The truth is that the economy is facing serious problems in the short to medium term. Now, I will resist the temptation to once again criticise the British government choosing the most economically damaging Brexit path. Suffice to say that the predetermined strategy of leaving both the single market and the customs union will go down in history as an act of callous self-economic harm. It's not just our trade with Europe, which is perilously close to disaster. If the UK leaves the customs union, new trade deals will be negotiated by the UK government rather than the EU. Given the disproportionate reliance of the UK on financial services and the power of the City of London lobby, there's a real prospect that the interest of Welsh manufacturing and agriculture will be sacrificed in order to gain more favourable treatment for the City of London. Now, trade negotiations are a bargaining process.
Negotiation between two sides. There's no doubt in my mind, looking at the personnel in the International Trade Department, their priority in these negotiations would be ensuring maximum access for the financial sector of London in markets of other countries. What will they want? They will want access to our food sector, of course. That'll be the obvious trade-off. And a prime example of this, of course, is what's happened with Chile, which, of course, has a European Union trade deal at the moment with the bloc. Despite our protestations that as a result of leaving the customs union, that would result in these third countries wanting to renegotiate their arrangement with the UK. What the British government say, no, we are the same, we the status quo, no problem, nothing will change. What do Chile want? They want enhanced access to our food markets, and that's a foretaste of what's facing the key sectors of the Welsh economy in Brexit Britannia.
As was set out in the Welsh Government's recent paper on trade deals, many of the poorest areas in Wales are the most dependent on either manufacturing or the agricultural industry. Areas prime for UK government to negotiate away their protections in search of trade deals.
But I will give way that the Welsh Government's statement yesterday on trade was deeply disappointing. The First Minister refusing to ensure that the Welsh Government would have a full say in what trade deals are signed in future. And the reality that's going to face Wales as a country is that Wallonia, a region of Belgium, will have greater say over European Union trade deals than Wales will have of future UK trade deals within the British state.
Order. I think the member's going a bit ahead of himself and thinks he's been given the second debate on the Brexit and the European Union. We need to stick to the budget, and I'm sure the member for Swansea West is going to respond to the budget.
Yeah. And in terms of the budget and implications on agricultural trade, is he aware that the WTA struck down the EU when they said they wouldn't allow hormone-impregnated beef into the EU and penalised them for that, but still the EU have resisted hormone-impregnated beef? Does he not think that if we stand alone against the United States and they want to impose hormone-impregnated beef on Welsh consumers, and the WTO are behind
Jonathan Edwards.
We'll have to like it or lump it.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes a very valid point, and indeed myself and the member for Caerphilly were recently over a few years ago we were over in the United States, where we had this very interesting discussion with the food lobby in the United States, and I can guarantee you they carry a lot of weight, and that I think is a clear indication of some of the problems we're going to face in future. But to return to the budget, Mr Owen, mewn polisi arianyddol,
monetary policy is another danger. The ultra-loose monetary policy of the central bank has sustained the economy since 2010, and the era of cheap money will gradually be removed as interest rates begin their journey to normalisation. During that period, economic growth has become even more reliant on consumer spending as a percentage of GDP. Failure to rebalance from an economy sustained by household debt would be a significant barrier in years to come.
Debt, of course, is reaching to the levels we were prior to the Great Crash in 2007, and that should be something that is of great concern to us all.
Recessions tend to come each decade, which means that 9 years after the great financial crash of 2008, we are far nearer the end of the cycle than its beginning. The failure to sharply rebound from the Great Crash, the failure to fundamentally rebalance sectorally and geographically, and the reliance of the economy and the life support of monetary policy does not bode well for the future.
Quickly from the Great Recession, the failure to rebalance sectorally and geographically, and the decade-long dependence on the life support of ultra-loose monetary policy does not bode well for the future. Ystyried graddfa.
Considering the scale of the challenge, this finance bill is in no way fit for purpose. Before addressing some of the measures in the bill, I would like to concentrate on some of the provision which are sadly missing. The UK economic model, which has been followed for decades by all the establishment parties of Westminster, is based on promoting activity and wealth in London and the southeast of England. The geographical wealth inequality should be a matter of shame for both Labour for all politicians in Westminster. 9 of the 10 poorest regions in Northern Europe are in the British state, as well as the richest, and unfortunately West Wales and North Wales are among the poorest. The overriding aim of the Treasury should be endeavouring to address this record of shame, that there's nothing in this finance bill that will seriously get to grips with the challenges facing us. One of the consequences of Brexit may be that financial companies based in London may relocate to Paris, Frankfurt and Dublin. Given that, the British government should react to this by focusing on other economic sectors, particularly manufacturing. This should lead to shifting the focus away from London to the nations and regions. First and foremost, Wales should be empowered to create our own economy. It is disgraceful that Scotland and Northern Ireland have stronger financial settlements than Wales, and given this, the Welsh economy will be under a severe disadvantage, and I cannot understand why politicians from the Unionist parties vote in favour of giving more powers to Scotland and Northern Ireland, but are unwilling to do so for our own nation. Even putting aside the constitutional imbalances, it means that the Welsh Government is less able to intervene in our economy. And if it's to be a hard Brexit, then the whole portfolio of taxes should be devolved, including APD, VAT and corporation tax. Infrastructure investment should be more evenly spread across the British state. Why should Welsh taxpayers' money be spent on English projects?
I'm very grateful because one of the votes that we had last week was about what we're going to do about the Palace of Westminster, and lots of people were anxious that we're going to be spending so much money in London. But isn't there a really important thing that we can do for every region of the United Kingdom, which is because we won't have after Brexit the skills in this country to complete the work on one of the biggest infrastructure projects in the country? Shouldn't we be setting up parliamentary apprenticeship schemes so that people can gain those skills in Wales, so that every constituency in Wales has somebody who ends up working on the project here?
Well,
The member for Rhondda raises a valid point. Personally, I didn't have an opportunity to make this point during the debate. I would have wanted to move Parliament away from London because I think that would have been a symbol of the need to economically devolve the British states too. But given the decision has now been made, and I congratulate the member for getting his amendment through, we should now take advantage of every opportunity to ensure that that investment is spread across the British state. And I do think that there is a real job to be done there, and I look to him to give leadership on this, given that he has led the debate for remaining here. So that's a job for him over the next few months.
On the question of apprenticeships, isn't it a time for us to have greater clarity as to businesses that headquarter outside of Wales with workers from Wales, and the money that is transferred from the Treasury here to Cardiff, and particularly with the levy that is raised on the police forces of Wales, which can apply to their wage packets, but does not come under the Welsh Government, and that does not reach their training packages.
That is an entirely fair point in terms of apprenticeships in policing, and it will be a point that members of our party will raise in this afternoon's debate on the floor of the House. But the fundamental question that we must ask, Mr. Owen, is that why Welsh taxpayers' money should be spent on English projects while the British government refuses to invest in Welsh projects and actually reneges on promises such as the electrification of the main line to Swansea. We've heard a great deal about that during this debate already. If the British government wants to raise productivity in low-performing geographical areas, then it must redirect investment into those areas as opposed to throwing everything at London. It's now widely agreed that sustained long-term investment in infrastructure is a prerequisite for economic success. If we look at such investment over recent decades, then what we see is a disproportionate share of such investment taking place in London and the southeast of England. And if you look at HS1, the Jubilee line, the Victoria line, Crossrail 1, Crossrail 2, the M25, HS2, there's been no comparable investment in any other country or region of the UK. Why? It's due to a number of factors, including the London-centric approach of the unionist parties. It could also be because of the economic models employed in evaluating such investments. Given the concentration of employment in London, the short-term return on every pound invested in infrastructure is likely to be higher there than in other parts of the UK. This in turn leads to a spiral where ever-increasing amounts of investment in transport go to London, and in turn the poorest regions spiral downwards. And I do believe that there's a lesson for us here in the Welsh context, and the point's already been made by my colleague from Ceredigion that investment at the Wales level by the Welsh Government is targeted more and more at Cardiff and the South East rather than being spread across our nation. In 2015-16, identifiable public expenditure per capita was £973 in London compared with £444 in Wales. If the level of spending in Wales were the same as in London, we would receive an additional £1.6 billion per annum for investment. Such wealth inequalities in the British state are so important that Treasury officials should be sent to Germany to learn from them how they went about addressing the geographical wealth inequalities following the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Of course, was to make a strategic decision that they were going to deal with the wealth inequalities within the reunified Germany, which was based on operating aids and tax incentives for the poorer regions, and of course the redirection and deliberate direction of foreign direct investment into the poorer parts of the state. And
failing that, give us in Wales the tools to move ahead with the job of building our own country, because history will demonstrate that waiting for Westminster governments of whatever colour to deliver for Wales is likely to address our problems. Wales has suffered not only from a lack of attention and investment by the UK government, but by the ineptitude of successive Labour governments in Wales and their inability to deliver. The latest efforts to create an economic strategy is remarkable in that it is a strategy without any measurable key performance indicators to be a guide to those who are to implement the strategy and to enable the rest of us to gauge how successful its implementation is. I'd like to finish now by turning to specific aspects of the budget, and it was a very weak budget in terms of the points contained within it. In terms of stamp duty holiday, now the Treasury Select Committee and the OBR and the IFS stated that the government's policy of giving a stamp duty holiday, which they were so vocal about, will push house prices up by some 0.3%, with most of the increase coming through this year. In the budget, £3 billion was provided to plan for Brexit. So rather than the 350 million for the health service that we were promised, we are spending almost 58 million pounds per week on bureaucracy in the British state. And the bureaucrats aren't even providing the answers that the government wants to hear, that they didn't want to hear asked. And a minute increase of 2.8 billion for the NHS in Wales, and this looks like too little, too late, given the stories in the press over the past few months. Now, given the winter crisis, we see the chronic impact of underfunding in the NHS in England. It's clear that we can't trust in the Conservatives to take care of the NHS in England. However, the record of Labour in Wales isn't much better. As with most things, they speak some warm words in Westminster, but where they're in power, the story is very different indeed. The changes to universal credit and plans to do away with the initial period of 7 days for claimants when they wouldn't have been wouldn't qualify for payments, and the reduction of the current waiting time from 6 weeks to 5 weeks for most claimants is to be welcomed. But this accounts in reality to putting a plaster on a broken leg. The unruly way in which universal credit was introduced and the way that welfare is administered more generally is disgraceful, involving private companies in a way that is immoral and irresponsible. Companies such as Capita shouldn't benefit from the misery of others. We welcome the introduction of a tax on products bought about in the UK, which will impact on Apple and Google and such companies, but we know once again that the Tories are opposed to many changes to our tax structure, which at the moment has escape loops, which allows for the avoidance of 13 million in taxation. There was no specific commitment to increase public sector pay either. It's been frozen and capped then at 1% since 2010. Thanks to inflation, this means that nurses' salary have faced a real-term cut of 14%. The Labour Party, unfortunately, couldn't put right this step in Wales, although they have the power to do so, as the SNP government has managed to do in Scotland. Wales still gets less per capita than London. Here are some of the poorest communities in Europe, and there are huge cuts to budget as a result of Brexit and significant challenges to crucial sectors of our economy, and yet the Chancellor chooses to use statistics that would be more appropriate from one of the red buses of the Foreign Secretary to claim that an increase of £1.2 billion in the Welsh budget emerging from the autumn statement. And it was very interesting during the Secretary of State's opening remarks. He didn't use that figure because he knows, as the leader of the Labour Party here today said on behalf of Welsh Labour MPs, over half of that is fiscal transactions that the Welsh Government will have to repay. There was no mention of the electrification of the railways, which have been cancelled despite the pledge given. No talk of the tidal lagoon in Swansea Bay, and no sign of it in the budget either. And funding for devolved services lower by some 750 million than they were at the beginning of the decade. That's the record of the British government when it comes to Wales, Mr. Owen. The story of this budget is quite clear. Westminster doesn't care about Wales.